Mrs. Clarissa Montrose, the bright red mouthpiece of the HOA, screamed across Willowbrook Gardens, "She's got a gun! Grab her now!" Just seconds later, the police arrived, but instead of cuffing my wife, they all stood at attention and saluted the badge on her chest. The entire neighborhood froze, and Clarissa looked like she'd been slapped across the face in front of everyone. Justice doesn't need to scream. It reveals itself when the tyrant's mask falls. So tell me, what state are you in? And do your HOAs this insane too? I still remember clearly the very first morning my wife and I moved into Willowbrook Gardens. The sky wasn't too sunny that day, but the air was slightly humid, carrying the smell of wild grass freshly turned over from unfinished yards, creating a sense that the entire neighborhood was still under construction, not just structurally, but in how it would eventually treat the people living inside it. Our little house sat at the end of a gray brick road, a discreet location, close enough to the center to feel the presence of watchful eyes far. The front yard had just been raked and seeded, the soil still dark and soft, that damp, earthy scent I love, a smell that stirred hope for a beginning, for something fresher than the long, worn-out years we'd left behind. I truly believed this place could be a different kind of start, a little peace after so many moves without goodbye. Naomi kept to her usual habit, a compact handgun at her hip, tucked neatly in a dark leather holster, always part of her outfit like it belonged there. Not for attention, not for show, simply because the job required. She worked in private investigation, sometimes entering places even the police hesitated to go. Carrying a firearm wasn't a choice for her, it was part of staying alive. The bare minimum a woman of color needs to arm herself with in this world. I understood that, had long accepted it, and in this state, it was perfectly legal. But what we didn't know, or weren't ready to believe, was that in places like Willowbrook Gardens, the law didn't always carry as much weight as the voice of whoever sat in the HOA chair, where soft power could be so soft it slowly choked the air out of your lungs before you even noticed. That morning, Naomi stepped out to check on the landscaping I'd just finished. The sun was still young, light as silk draped across the leaves, making everything look as gentle as a brochure photo. She bent slightly to inspect the lavender pots I'd picked up from the weekend market, her movements slow, like she was trying to belong here. But not even a few minutes later, I heard the sound of heels tapping deliberately on the brick path. The rhythm was clear and intentional, like a wordless announcement saying, "I'm here, and I want you to know it." From the far end of the road, a figure emerged, tall, trim, perfectly styled blonde hair, and a light-colored suit bordering on white. Not an accidental choice compared to the muted natural tones of the street in early morning. She walked like the entire road was her personal runway. Clarissa Montrose, president of the HOA, approached with a half-smile that did nothing to hide the scrutiny in her eyes. It wasn't the look of a neighbor hoping to make friends. It was the look of a high-end prison guard doing a room check, where power doesn't belong to the reasonable, but to whoever's loudest and knows the right. Clarissa's eyes landed on the gun at Naomi's. For a split second, her smile curled upward. I immediately felt something deeply wrong coming, like a black storm you see from miles away but have no way of avoiding. "This isn't a place for flaunting weapons," Clarissa said, loud enough for others nearby to hear, even if they weren't invited into the conversation. "Willowbrook is a civilized community, not some low-class neighborhood." I glanced at Naomi. She kept a calm expression, the kind of calm I knew was staged because underneath it, a wave was gathering. I could hear the contempt laced through every word Clarissa spoke. Her words weren't just about the gun, they were about us, people who didn't fit, who weren't what she wanted in the pristine image she'd constructed for this place. I tried to keep my voice neutral. "Ma'am, carrying a firearm here is completely legal. My wife has a valid professional reason." Clarissa let out a dry, metallic laugh that made my skin crawl. "State law doesn't matter more than the rules here. I'm the one who defines safety for this community." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She spoke as if she were the living constitution, the crowned ruler of this patch of land. Naomi said nothing, just gave my hand a light squeeze, a warning grip that meant, "Don't escalate." Not yet, but Clarissa didn't stop. "You're new here, so you ought to learn when to keep your mouth shut," she said, her eyes sweeping over us like appraising merchandise. "Residents here don't need images that lower property value." Something flared in me that I couldn't quite name, part anger, part contempt, and part fear. I'd dealt with plenty of difficult people before, but Clarissa was different. She didn't need to raise her voice to strike. She hit with her gaze, with words sharpened to injure, without leaving blood. Before I could respond, Clarissa pulled out her phone, her movements brisk and practiced, like someone who'd done this many times, or at least rehearsed it in her mind. 911, "I'd like to report," she said clearly, deliberately. "An armed black woman illegally carrying a weapon, threatening residents in the neighborhood." Words like black, weapon, and threatening were emphasized like sparks tossed onto dry kindling. I saw curtains flutter, neighbors peeking out. Some frowned, Some smirked, and a few stared with uncovered fear. Clarissa stood there like she had just wrapped the opening act of a play where she was both director and lead. Naomi finally spoke. Her voice was low and sharp, cutting through the performance like a bullet through glass. "Mrs. Montrose, you're making things up. I'm carrying legally, and no one has the right to stop me." Clarissa didn't back down. "If I say it's illegal here, then it's illegal. Willowbrook will not be stained by people like you." That line landed like a punch. No more pretense. Discrimination, contempt, blunt and bare. Naomi didn't blink, and I clenched my fist so tightly, my knuckles turned white. One question pounded through my mind. Were we wrong to think this place could ever be peaceful? Not long after, the sound of sirens cut through the air, the exact kind of intervention Clarissa had been waiting for. 3 police cars sped in, red and blue lights sweeping across the quiet white homes. Residents spilled out, gathering behind fences like spectators at a theater watching a live drama. Clarissa lifted her chin and turned to me, as if to say, "See?" I swallowed hard. Part of me wanted to scream. Part of me wanted to stay calm so Naomi wouldn't be dragged into the trap that had been so carefully set. But Naomi, as always, looked at me and said just one thing: "Don't worry, they'll see the truth." As the officers stepped out of their cars, their eyes passed over us, over the gun at Naomi's hip, finally landed on Clarissa, who had already launched into her speech about the threat. But in the suffocating tension of a morning that should have been quiet, I understood one thing. Willowbrook Gardens might look like a suburban paradise, but beneath the white-painted surface was a battlefield waiting to erupt. And the first shot didn't need a weapon, just power and prejudice. Clarissa Montrose never knew the meaning of hesitation. While I was still searching for the right words to keep this conversation from turning into a battlefield, she already spoke through gritted teeth, her tone sharp as a needle-piercing skin. "You newcomers need to remember, this HOA makes the rule. If you don't follow them, that gate will see you out." She wasn't speaking. She was declaring, issuing a decree, as if the entire neighborhood were her private estate and the residents merely tenants in a castle she had built. Naomi looked up at her, lips curling into a calm, almost serene smile that made me even more. "What rule says I can't myself?" The question was light, but exposed Clarissa's absurdity without effort. And yet, with a woman like her, logic never stood a chance against the self-anointed power she wielded. Clarissa's face flushed deep red, the thick layers of makeup unable to hide the pulsing veins beneath. She yanked out her phone and jabbed the call button for 911, hissing every word. "There's an armed black woman, illegally carrying threatening residents." The word black rang out with pointed malice, exaggerated to twist a routine moment into a criminal spectacle. I could hear faint noises behind the curtain, someone giggling like they were watching free entertainment, others silent, eyes prying. Few whispers floated through the air, part curiosity, part fear. The once quiet street had turned into a stage, and Clarissa stood tall, chin raised like a queen issuing judgment, certain that her phone call would bring my entire family to its knees. I clenched my fists, rising through every joint in my body. I had known Clarissa was the type who needed to feel superior, but seeing her in action revealed the depth of her arrogance. To her, power wasn't about consensus. It was about turning fear into a weapon. And in the instant she pressed that call button, I knew we had officially been dragged into the authoritarian game she knew all too well. Naomi didn't flinch. She stood firm, eyes locked on Clarissa, that mocking smile now clearer. It was her silence, her defiance, that made the other woman even more furious. Clarissa raised her chin higher and turned to a few neighbors who had doubt, shouting, "You all heard me. I've called the police. Here in Willowbrook, we don't let people with weapons stain our neighborhood." The words struck like a hammer, aimed not only at Naomi, but at our skin, our status, our right to exist. I saw faces at the windows, some tinged with pity, but most were indifferent, as if they'd grown used to Clarissa turning anyone into the villain of her. A middle-aged woman across the street shook her head and yanked her curtain shut. A teenage boy standing on the porch stifled a laugh as his mother muttered, "Nothing but trouble." Those small fragments of reaction were enough to show how much fear and quiet resentment Clarissa had sown into this community. Heels struck hard against the brick road. Clarissa stepped back half a pace, inhaled deeply, then stared at us with the smugness of someone who believed she'd just conquered an enemy. That upright posture revealed everything. The pride of someone who believed herself entitled. The satisfaction of watching a black family dragged into the spotlight of a judgment she had crafted in advance. I wanted to speak, to shout in her face that she had crossed the line, that the law she kept invoking was nothing but a veil for open discrimination. But Naomi placed her hand hand gently on my arm, her eyes cold and steady. "Let them come," Naomi whispered. "The truth will show itself." Meanwhile, Clarissa turned and raised her voice to the crowd. "Take a good look, everyone. This is exactly why we must be vigilant with newcomers. If we don't stay firm, this entire place will turn into a dump." Each word landed like a stone blocking our path. I looked around and saw a few residents nodding in agreement, but others kept their heads down, clearly unwilling to challenge the HOA president direct. With a single phone call, Clarissa had turned the whole neighborhood into a stage. She stood there, lips still curled in a self-satisfied grin, as if she had just fulfilled a noble duty. But to me, it was the face of raw authoritarianism, a person who twisted truth feed a sick sense of self-importance. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer, echoing off the wall, thickening the air around us. Clarissa turned again, eyes gleaming, standing squarely in the middle of the street, as if waiting for the final act of the play she had. I took a deep breath, heart racing, but Naomi's gaze stayed calm, unwavering. I knew the moment ahead wouldn't just determine Naomi's dignity, it would be the first true test of our life in Willowbrook Gardens. If we backed down, Clarissa would swallow the very right we had to exist. But if we stood our ground, it would mark the beginning of a confrontation she had never imagined. Tires screeched against brick, red and blue lights flashing across the window glass. The whole neighborhood turned to look, dozens of eyes fixed on the scene, waiting to see how Clarissa's play would end. And in that moment, I understood one thing. She had cast herself as the most ridiculous villain in the very stage of power she worked so hard to build. The piercing sound of the siren cut through the neighborhood's tense silence like a cold blade slicing open the compressed air. In less than a minute, 3 police cars surged onto the street, tires screeching across the brick pavement like a growl announcing that power was closing in. Red and blue lights spun across white-painted walls, casting flickering flashes like warning signals. Window panes rattled with the vibration of the vehicles, curtains lifted just slightly, faces appeared in the glow, every one of them holding their breath. The crowd began to spill out into the front yard, some with arms crossed, others pretending to water plant, and a few children dragged quickly back inside. But the atmosphere had changed. No longer peaceful, no longer a model community, but a public stage where everyone waited for the finale of the drama Clarissa Montrose had been directing all along. I stood in the middle of our yard, hands ice cold, heart pounding like it was ready to tear through my chest. Clarissa stepped forward, her pace urgent, posture composed, as if she were commanding the scene. Her hand, heavy with glittering rings, shot forward, pointing straight at Naomi with deliberate outrage, an unhidden theatricality. "That's her! Restrain her, she's armed and dangerous." Her voice rang out, not as a warning, but as a verdict she had already rendered, with the police cast as acts following her script. Every word dropped like a stone, as if she were carving a monument to herself. 3 officers stepped out of the vehicles, their movements swift and precise, as if programmed in advance. Hands rested on holsters, eyes scanning the yard, scanning us, then locking on Naomi, their bodies tightened like drawn bows. I could hear the rhythmic click of soles striking brick, each step cold and deliberate, not a word spoken, no greeting, no inquiry, just silence and pressure. They were trained to show no emotion, but I could feel the alertness radiating from each blink. Clarissa backed away, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. She turned to the crowd gathered behind the fence and raised her voice with unmasked pride. "I told you, this is why I have to protect Willowbrook. If I don't act in time, who will?" Her voice rang out like an alarm bell, casting herself as the hero, the last line of defense for the community. I clenched my fists, my whole body holding back an eruption, but Naomi showed no sign of wavering. She stood still, gaze unshaken, feet rooted. Every fiber of her body seemed braced with steel will. I saw it clearly. No fear, no rage, only a cold resolve. She slowly raised her hand, deliberately, without a tremble. Each movement was calculated. Her fingers reached for the buttons on her coat, unfastening them one by one, under the scrutiny of not just the 3 officers, but of an entire neighborhood watching from behind curtains and fences. The coat opened, revealing a bright badge resting on her left chest. Sunlight hit the metal surface, making it blaze like the sun itself in a forest of suspicious eyes. For a moment, everything froze. The 3 officers stopped in unison, as if they had slammed into an invisible wall. They looked at one another, then almost by reflex, snapped to attention. One of them stepped forward half a pace, raised a hand in salute, and said clearly, "Yes, ma'am." The words came out not just as a greeting, but as a confirmation. The other 2 quickly followed, creating a scene no one had a sharp, sudden turn like a thunderclap across Clarissa's face and every face behind. Clarissa stood paralyzed. Her eyes widened, her mouth hung open, one hand still suspended midair, as if her body refused to obey her brain. Carefully made-up face had gone pale, drained of all color. I could hear the whispers beginning to swell from behind. She messed with the wrong one. Is she an agent? Unbelievable. The murmurs spread like waves, pushing Clarissa back. A few laughs broke out, stifled, quiet, smug, but there were also a few disappointed heads. In a single instant, the entire neighborhood had flipped. Naomi didn't need to say a word. She simply buttoned her coat back up slowly, as if she had never been threatened. The three officers, who only moments ago had seemed like machines ready to act, now stood at attention like cadets awaiting orders from a superior. It all unfolded in stunned silence, in disbelief, and in a humiliation that could not be hidden. I stepped forward one pace, didn't raise my voice, didn't defend. I just spoke clearly enough for Clarissa to hear. You thought being HOA president gave you power above the law? Now you know better. Clarissa stammered, lips trembling like someone struck by a chill. No, this is fake. I didn't know, but she couldn't finish because the crowd had stopped listening. The wary eyes had shifted direction. They no longer looked at Naomi with fear, but at Clarissa with disgust. A woman who had ruled the entire block with her voice was now being suffocated by the very arrogance she had wielded. Naomi looked at Clarissa and said nothing. Her gaze was cold and steady as stone. Then she turned to the three officers, her voice clear and firm. The situation is obvious. You know what to put in your report. There was no clearer command than that. The air seemed to compress, then snap. One officer nodded. The other two glanced Clarissa with a brief look that said, "There's nothing left to discuss." Clarissa staggered, each backward step peeling away a layer of the power she once wore. She was no longer the commanding HOA president, but a small woman lay bare in the very place she used to stand above others. I saw her eyes scanning the crowd, searching for sympathy, but no hand reached out, face twisted, part fury, part despair. And maybe, for the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to be exposed in public. I looked at the neighborhood once more, the white-painted fences, the neatly trimmed lawns, the hollow smile. Willowbrook Gardens looked peaceful, but its surface was frighteningly thin. Today, that mask was torn away, exposing an old truth. Prejudice doesn't need a weapon. It only needs a word from someone who believes they stand above others. But there are times when truth comes back, and when it does, it doesn't need to shout. It only needs a badge. Call to action. If you witnessed this scene, how would you feel watching someone who thought they held all the power get flipped upside down in seconds? Share your thoughts in the comments. Clarissa Montrose staggered, carefully painted face beginning to crack under the morning sun and the cold stares of those who once called her Madam President. Powder could no longer hide the panic creeping into her eyes. She trembled, lips pressed tight, as if trying to hold on to the last shred of dignity, but she couldn't contain it any longer. A shrill, sharp, panicked scream burst out, with no trace of her usual arrogance. "Fake badge. Don't be fooled. I've seen tricks like this before." The words rang out harsh and bitter, bouncing off the stone wall behind her like the scratch of someone thrashing inside a trap of their own making. The entire neighborhood seemed to pause for a beat, every sound falling into an eerie stillness that stretched few seconds too long, like an entire century squeezed into a breath. All eyes turned to the three officers standing beside Naomi. That silence wasn't agreement. It was a suspended moment, waiting to see what would happen next, hovering between reason and react, between justice and the old habit of submission. One of the officers, tall and lean, with a face carved in sharp lines, stepped forward. His gaze remained calm, but his voice sliced through Clarissa's bravado like a blade. "You just filed a false report. Abusing the 911 line is a serious criminal offense, Mrs. Montrose." Each word hit like a hammer in the already tense air, freezing Clarissa in place. The name Montrose, once a symbol of her self-claimed power, now rang with accusation, delivering a final blow that shattered the illusion years building around her. I took another step, now just a few feet from her. In front of me was no longer the woman who once ruled the block with warning letters and parking fines. Now she was just a crumbling figure, panicked and unraveling, clinging to empty authority like a torn life. I looked her in the eye and spoke slowly but firmly. "You really thought wealth and that HOA seat gave you the right to smear anyone?" I didn't wait for an answer, because that question wasn't for her. It was for the whole neighborhood, the ones who had bowed to Clarissa's rallying cries and now stood witness to a fall beyond repair. Naomi stood beside me in silence. She didn't raise her voice, didn't explain. Her eyes locked onto Clarissa, not with anger, not with contempt, but with something higher. It was a look that said she had already risen past all of this, no longer bound by the warped rules Clarissa had invented. Her voice was cold, steady. "You picked the wrong woman to humiliate." The badge still peeked from beneath her half-buttoned coat, the metal catching the sun like a flash of light, sharp and clean, slicing straight through the layers of fake power Clarissa had worn like armor every day. Around us, the crowd remained in small clusters. No one spoke, but the murmurs began to rise. An old man with silver hair there, tucked behind a wooden fence, muttered, "She's gone too far this time." A younger woman, clutching her child tightly, covered her mouth and let out a quiet giggle, her gaze fixed on Clarissa as if watching a cheap comedy with an ending everyone could see coming. The air shifted from suffocating to buzzing, from tense to quietly triumphant, because for the first time in years, people were seeing the HOA queen cornered with no way out. Clarissa kept struggling in the swamp of her own making. She turned, scanning the crowd, searching for a look of support, a nod, even just a furrowed brow of sympathy. But all she received was merciless silence and eyes that turned away. The very people who once bowed their heads to her sermons about community standard were now backing away like avoiding the dying flame of a fire. Silent, but it was the cruelest punishment of all. Another officer, shorter and younger looking, hand still hovering near his weapon out of habit, stepped forward and spoke clearly, without pretense. "We have the full recording of the call. There's nothing left to argue. Every action has been documented, and you will be held accountable." That statement pushed Clarissa closer to the edge. Her lips released a meaningless gasp, and her phone slipped from her hand, clattering onto the brick pavement, a dry, hollow sound loaded with symbolism. Everything she clung to was falling away. I looked down at the woman, now trembling like a leaf in a storm, feeling a strange mixture of bitterness and satisfaction inside. Bitterness that a peaceful community had been manipulated for so long by fear and pretense. Satisfaction that today, the circle of control had finally been punctured, and no one else, Clarissa, had done it to herself. Naomi didn't take her eyes off. The calm in her gaze seemed to drop the temperature by a few degrees. Clarissa stepped back, slipping slightly, as if the ground beneath her was no longer solid. I did it to protect the neighborhood," she stammered, voice weak, on the edge of tears. "I did it for everyone's good," but no one believed her. She had used the phrase, "for the good of the community," as a weapon to crush others one too many times, and today that weapon had turned against. A voice rang out suddenly from the crowd, firm and clear. "Protecting the community by lying and humiliating people?" A truth delivered without force, but it struck like a finishing blow. A few people nodded. Some began to speak, as if released from a long-standing curse. Clarissa blinked rapidly, her hands trembling uncontrollably, glancing around as if she no longer recognized where she was. I realized this was the moment when false power was torn apart. Clarissa Montrose, the woman who once stood at the center of neighborhood meetings like a judge without a bench, was now just a shadow, trembling, alone, teetering on the edge between justice and quiet disdain. Naomi stepped forward once more, her voice steady, not loud, clear enough for the entire neighborhood to hear. "Mrs. Montrose, a person's dignity cannot be trampled just so you can flaunt power. And if you think you can keep doing that, consider this your wake-up call." Clarissa froze, like a puppet with a string. Her gaze shattered, no anchor left, no mask thick enough to hide the collapse. The murmurs kept spreading, like slow fire creeping through dry grass, and in that fleeting moment, all of Willowbrook Gardens, with its white fences and artificial floral dresses, witnessed the fall of its self-claimed queen, not through a vote, but by the very tyranny she had nursed so long. Everything changed after that morning. Not instantly, not in the way people clapped for Naomi or neighbors came over to apologize, but the heavy silence that had once blanketed Willowbrook Gardens began to crack, and through those cracks, fragments of truth started to seep in. Naomi didn't say anything that day, but I knew she wouldn't stop just because Clarissa had been publicly brought down. For Naomi, justice wasn't a dramatic moment in front of a crowd. It was made of quiet, relentless cuts that missed nothing. A week later, I saw Naomi sitting in front of her laptop for hours. The steady sound of typing echoed every night, the soft blue glow casting shadows on her focused face. On the table was a file of documents she had printed from data quietly accessed through a technical loophole in the HOA's internal system, something Clarissa never saw coming. I read through emails exchanged between her and key members of the neighborhood board. A chill crawled down my spine when I saw lines like, "House number 78 parked over the line again, give them another citation. They need to know this isn't some low-rent complex." And another, from Clarissa herself, "That house with the Independence Day flag looks, but don't touch Anne's house. They're investors in the development." Each email landed like a slap to the illusion of fairness this neighborhood once claimed to uphold. Naomi didn't react much, just highlighted sections and filed them with cold precision. Every detail she found was like turning over a patch of rotted soil beneath fake grass. The letters printed with the HOA's logo were stacked neatly, but they carried the weight of judgment. Clarissa wasn't just just biased. She was systematically, arrogantly, and deliberately racist. Anyone with different skin, a different accent, or the wrong income level became a target in a power game disguised as maintaining community standards. Naomi wasn't the only one who noticed. After Clarissa's performance unraveled in front of the police, residents started whispering more. A shift stirred in the air, like people were waiting for someone to go first so they could finally speak. And one weekend morning, at the small park in the middle of the neighborhood, when Naomi laid out printed documents on the wooden public table, a few people stepped forward. First, there were hesitant glances, then came quiet stories, and quickly, the atmosphere began to crack open. A middle-aged man, short and sun-worn from working outdoors, was the first to speak. She sent me 3 warning letters just because my trash bin was less than 2 inches from the fence, his voice caught, as if it carried the weight of a year spent under surveillance. She even said if I didn't comply, I'd be brought before a community meeting for disciplinary action. Disciplinary action for what? Thin, sharp-featured woman with short hair cut in, I was fined for hanging a small flag on Memorial Day. Meanwhile, she hung a huge banner advertising a home sale for a whole month, and no one said a word. The stories came fast. One person said they were threatened over painting their front door in a color not pre-approved. Another said their request to repair the roof was denied, even though it followed every rule, because they were a single person without enough standing. Every story had one common thread. They weren't Clarissa's friends, and they didn't fit the right kind she wanted to keep in the neighborhood. I recorded everything, not to file a complaint for the sake of it, but because the picture was becoming increasingly clear. Naomi sat beside me, quietly taking notes, her eyes fixed on each speaker. She didn't need to pry, just to listen and let people finally loosen the knots they had been swallowing for too long. With every story, I saw Clarissa more clearly. She never protected the community as she preached. She ruled it, with selective harshness, using authority as a mini dictatorship. Every citation was a threat. Every email was a directive to preserve a fake order, selectively enforced only to protect her inner circle. The anger, repressed for years, began to rise like magma beneath a volcano. No one wanted to stay silent anymore. No one wanted to be pushed out of their home for not fitting the community image. An elderly man with silver hair pointed at a printed email Naomi had brought, his hand trembling slightly, and said, "We let her go too far for too long." And maybe he was right. The long silence was the glue that had kept Clarissa's throne intact for all these years. But now, that throne was beginning to crack as people finally gave a name to the injustice they had endured. That afternoon, as we left the park, no one said goodbye, but I knew something had shifted. Naomi gathered the papers as neatly as she had laid them out, but her eyes were brighter, not with victory, but with the knowledge that truth finally found a voice. Inside, though I said nothing, I understood. From now on, fight in Willowbrook Gardens wasn't about a gun or a badge. It was a battle against the fake polish of standard, a slow dismantling of the glossy authoritarianism hidden behind pristine houses and freshly cut lawns. And I believe for Naomi that fight was beginning. The next morning, before the sunlight had fully pierced through the thin layer of mist covering the carefully trimmed lawns of Willowbrook Gardens, every resident received an unexpected emergency notice. Text messages and emails arrived almost simultaneously, beginning with the same tired phrasing that had become Clarissa Montrose's signature. For the good of the community, your attendance is mandatory. No specific reason was given, but everyone understood. After the humiliating fall the day before, Clarissa was trying to regain control. She never conceded easily, never. And this time, she chose Central Hall, the white-painted building next park where pointless meetings and so-called community festivals were held, always for the same familiar circle. The hall felt cold, fluorescent lights casting a pale glow over the straight rows of plastic chairs, creating the atmosphere of an interrogation room rather than a place for dialogue. Beneath that washed-out light, people crowded in, elderly couples with silver hair, young parents cradling babies, a few transient renters, all carrying an emotion hard to name, forced curiosity, a hint of hope for vindication, and a low-burning irritation. The air was thick, as if someone had sprinkled salt over a wound that hadn't yet healed. Clarissa entered as she always did, in a light-colored, crisply pressed suit, her steps slower than usual, but still trying to project confidence. Face was carefully made up, her lips painted bold, but the lipstick couldn't hide the traces of a sleepless night, faint shadows under her eyes, a twitch at the corner of her mouth. Each step toward the wooden podium felt heavier than before, because now the eyes watching her weren't filled with admiration or fear, but scrutiny and doubt. She cleared her throat, clutched the paper in her hand, and began to speak, her voice louder than necessary, as if volume could suppress the tremble in her chest. I am protecting the values of Willowbrook. If we allow people with guns to stay, we will lose all our reputation. Her voice bounced off the ceiling and echoed back down. dry and hollow. Words like values and reputation rang empty, like a worn-out melody replayed so often no one believed it anymore. The seats below stirred. There were throat clearings, a few head shakes, then a sound rang out like a church bell. An old man in the front row, with snowy hair, a small frame, but eyes sharp as blades, tapped his cane once firmly on the wooden floor. He leaned forward and spoke in a gravelly, low voice, but each word landed like a bell at noon. Reputation? Tired of your bullying and your bigotry. The room fell silent for a moment, not out of fear, but surprise. Clarissa froze, as if someone had just slapped her across the face. She tried to recover, biting her lower lip before speaking again, her voice still forced into a higher. Mr. Henderson, you've been misled. I'm the only one keeping this neighborhood safe, but the defense now sounded more like a plea. The crowd was no longer under the control of the name Clarissa Montrose. A small, mocking laugh came from the back. A few people nodded, whispering to each other, as if each word she spoke only made her facade more transparent. Clarissa could feel the resist growing. Her hands clutched both sides of the podium, knuckles blanched white. Naomi sat beside me, silent from the start, hands interlocked, face unreadable, but I knew that look. It was the look of someone who had long been ready, waiting for the exact moment. As soon as Clarissa finished speaking, Naomi rose. She stepped calmly between the rows of chairs, quiet but certain, like a living verdict walking toward the accused. Her voice rang out, not loud, precise, as clear as a judge's gavel. I am a federal agent, and as of today, I am officially overseeing this HOA for its abuses of power, discrimination, and psychological intimidation of residents. No one reacted immediately. The room froze for 1 second, then erupted. Gasps echoed in unison. Chairs shifted. People sat up as if jolted awake. Some turned fully to one another, as if unable to believe what they had just heard. Naomi didn't raise her badge. She simply pulled it from her coat pocket, the polished metal catching the fluorescent light, not blinding, but impossible to ignore. It was a silent declaration, living proof of every accusation Clarissa had tried to twist and deny. Clarissa went pale. The color drained from her face in an instant. Her hands gripped the podium's edge, joints trembling as if they might collapse. Her carefully painted lips quivered, pressed together to hold back a sob or a denial. But it was far too late. The seat of power she had occupied for years, throne built from fear and arrogance, was crumbling, and the people she had once ruled no longer bowed. They looked directly at her, without fear, without reverence, only long-buried anger, now finally allowed to speak. A young woman near the door, holding a small child in her arm, was the first to stand. Her voice trembled, but her eyes burned bright. We've endured enough for years. Thank you for standing up and exposing the truth. Applause broke out, first in the back, hesitant and scattered. But then, one clap after another, it spread, building in force, thundering like waves crashing against stone, as if the entire room was being washed clean of the resentment that had lingered far too long. Clarissa stood there, lost in the sound she once controlled, now turning back on her like a weapon. She said nothing more. Her face was frozen, her eyes locked in a daze as if hypnotized. The people who once bowed to her were no longer silent. They stood, said their names, told their stories, and spoke up. A man with salt and pepper hair said loudly, "I was once threatened with eviction just for refusing to repaint my house in the approved color palette. I haven't forgotten." An older woman added, "She once told me I didn't fit the image of this neighborhood because I wore traditional clothes." Each statement was a blade cutting into the lie. I looked around and saw the change. Eyes that once avoided contact now met each other direct. Heads that once bowed now lift. Clarissa, who once manipulated fear, now had to stand before an entire room of people she tried to control and listen to them list her offenses. Naomi didn't need to say anything more. She had done enough with presence alone, with a truth couldn't be denied. And with that truth, Mrs. Montrose now had to face she never expected, a community that no longer feared her. Naomi was never the kind of person to let things pass in silence. Right after that meeting, she began combing through every document, record, and file that could trace the path of Clarissa Montrose's authority. I saw her sitting through the night in front of her computer, the glow of the screen casting a pale light across her steely face, each line of text, each email opening like a new piece of evidence, stripping away the facade of someone who once called herself the protector of Willowbrook's value. The deeper Naomi dug, the more details she uncovered that made my blood boil. Dozens of internal emails showed Clarissa had deliberately targeted families of color, fining them for petty violations like fence height, garage door paint, or grass length. Meanwhile, her wealthy friends were free to break the rule. Cars parked across sidewalks, loud parties, even unauthorized construction without ever receiving a citation. The emails were cold and dry, but the injustice embedded in every sentence so sharp I wanted to rip the screen apart. Naomi carefully printed every document, the stack thickening into a dossier of accusation. She underlined key phrases, scribbled notes in the margin. "See this?" Naomi said, voice calm but firm. She didn't manage this neighborhood, she ruled it. The next day, as residents gathered again, Naomi made part of the documents public. No one could claim ambiguity anymore. The emails were read aloud, Naomi's voice echoing through the room, each word hitting the tiled floor like a hammer. People's jaws dropped, hands covered their mouths, and some shivered hearing their own families mentioned in the lists of absurd penalties. A middle-aged man wearing a wrinkled, button-down shirt stood up, his voice growing steadier. "She threatened to evict me because my trash bin was in the wrong spot. I apologize. I fixed it immediately, but she still fined me and called it persistent misconduct." His words landed like an old wound torn open, painful but needing to be seen. Another young woman stepped forward, eyes glassy. "I was fined for hanging a small flag on a holiday. The flag was the size of my hand. I put it up so my son could feel proud, and she said it damaged the neighborhood image." At the same time, her house had a massive real estate banner out front. No one said a word because she was the one in charge. Her voice caught, but each word slashed through what little was left of Clarissa's crumbling authority. The room erupted with one testimony after another. An elderly man told how he was fined for owning a small dog that allegedly exceeded the weight limit, while Clarissa kept 3 dogs twice the size and no one dared question it. A single mother spoke of her son being banned from the community pool for being too loud, even though Clarissa's grandkids had been there that same day, screaming louder, and no one said a thing. I sat there, recording every testimony, my hands trembling with fury. Each story came together like pieces of a dark puzzle. Clarissa wasn't protecting the community. She was using the power of the HOA as a weapon to punish the vulnerable, the different, to reinforce her tiny throne. This wasn't management. This was tyranny. Naomi turned to look at me, her eyes blazing. Now it's not just a feeling. It's evident. This entire neighborhood has been living under her rule far too long. The flood of accusations continued. People stood, pushing forward to recount the years of coercion, public shaming, and fines so absurd they were forced to sell their homes below market value. An elderly couple, eyes wet, shared how they were forced to remove their patio furniture because it didn't match the aesthetic standard, while Clarissa built an entire rooftop deck bursting with garish decor. Every story drove another blade into the fabricated image Clarissa had spent years constructing. I looked over at Clarissa and saw her sitting motionless, the once proud face now ghostly pale, makeup streaked with sweat. Her hands were clenched, knuckles bleached white. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an friendly face, but every gaze around her was sharp as knives. Someone let out a dry chuckle, another clucked their tongue, and a man muttered bitterly, "All these years we stayed quiet and let her run the place like that." The air was thick, and the rage that had been compressed for years was finally erupting. Nothing could hold it back now. My heart felt heavy. Part of it was anger, but part of it was bitterness. Why did it take this long? Why only now, when Naomi stood up, when the emails were exposed, did people find the courage to speak? How many families had been pushed out? How many children had grown up under the fear of being targeted? That silence was the fertile soil where Clarissa Montrose cultivated her authoritarian rule. But now, that silence had shattered. The accusations thundered through the room, each voice an arrow aimed squarely at Clarissa. With every person who stood, another secret was unearthed, another wound exposed, until all of it built into a verdict could not be undone. Naomi let them speak, never interrupt. When the chaos began to settle, she finally spoke, clear and sharp. "You've all seen it. This is no longer a personal matter. This is how Clarissa Montrose has run the HOA for years. Through discrimination, through coercion, through selectively crafted penalties aimed at the vulnerable. She didn't protect Willow. She turned it into her private kingdom." The applause erupted, no longer hesitant. Hands clapped together like a pathway clearing for justice, like flames burning through the false curtain that had shrouded this neighborhood for so long. I looked Clarissa and saw her trembling, eyes brimming with tears, but I knew they weren't tears of remorse. They were the tears of someone who realized she had lost everything. In that moment, I understood true power didn't lie in an HOA seat, in property, or in manufactured prestige. It lived in the voice of the community. And when that voice rose together, together, no one could silence. Clarissa Montrose had been stripped bare, and the outrage surged like fire, consuming the rotting throne she had once sat upon so firm. The air inside the hall after the wave of accusations had grown so thick it was suffocating. The room felt as if it could no longer breathe, each breath carrying tension and weight. The pale fluorescent lights above continued to shine steadily, but instead of brightening the space, they only made everyone seem more worn, as though being exposed beneath an invisible light of judgment. Every eye in the room was fixed on one point: Clarissa Montrose, the woman who had once sat firmly in the HOA president's chair for years, once considered the unshakable symbol of power in Willowbrook Gardens, now stood shrunken behind the wooden podium, her back stiff like a stone beginning to crack. Her hands trembled, gripping the podium's edge as if letting go would collapse the world beneath her feet. But what she was really clinging to wasn't the podium. It was a fading illusion of power, crumbling like sand through her fingers. In the vast room, even the sound of breathing seemed amplified, as if everyone was counting down to a moment couldn't predict, but knew was coming. Naomi, always knowing when to move, didn't let that silence drag on into something empty. She rose, her movement firm but unrushed, face set like bronze. In her hand was a folder, spine labeled clearly, not a prop, but a dossier built through sleepless nights. She stepped to the center, her voice rising clean and sharp, each word like a hammer striking the table. "I present this evidence before the residents and the board. This is an official investigative order from the Department of Justice." The words dropped like thunder ripping through the still air. The room erupted like a wave breaking the surface. Plastic chairs scraped loudly against the wooden floor. Some gasped behind covered mouths. A few stood up instinctively. Eyes widened, throats tightened, not in disbelief of Naomi, but in disbelief that what they had only dared to hope was finally real. Truth had arrived, and it had arrived through the most legitimate channel possible. The pages Naomi held, each one stamped, named, numbered, were no longer emotional accusations. They were legal proof, the beginning of the end for a twisted reign. Clarissa stood frozen, her eyes bulged, mouth slightly open, as if to object, but no sound came. Face flushed crimson, then drained white, as if all the blood had been pulled from her in a single breath. Panic surged behind her eyes, and when her voice did break through, came out strangled, warped, like someone drowning. "You dare!" But she never finished the sentence, because a decisive movement behind her silenced all resistance. The two police officers who had been sitting silently at the back of the hall since the beginning were no longer observers. They stood, walking briskly but without urgency, their hard-soled shoes striking the wooden floor with a sharp, cold rhythm. The room held its breath. They didn't need to speak. Their actions spoke for them. They approached the podium, positioning themselves on either side of Clarissa, who now looked smaller than ever. One officer reached for his handcuff, the snap of metal ringing out, sharp and chilling. Without a question, without a word, Clarissa's hands in full view of the entire neighborhood. The metallic click of the cuffs rang out like a final shot, severing the last threads of power Clarissa had clung to. It was louder than any of her past tirade, more resounding than all her long-winded speeches used to suppress crowd. Clarissa staggered, her steps faltering, high heels slipping slightly on the floor, her heavily painted face now exposing every crack of exhaustion and decay. Face froze, her eyes scanning the room in desperation, searching for a sympathetic nod, hand reaching out to save her, but there was no one. Only cold faces, sharp eyes that had once been silent, now cutting like blades. I stepped forward, not quickly, not slowly, until I stood right beside Clarissa. I leaned in slightly, not smiling, not gloating, just speaking loud enough for her alone to hear. "This is what real law looks like, Clarissa, and it's not on your..." The words weren't loud, but they struck her like a verdict. Clarissa froze, shoulders slumping, collapsing inward. Her eyes were hollow, no longer angry, only a... The crowd below stirred as if awakening from a long sleep. The first clap came from the corner, a silver-haired man, his face streaked with tears. Then came a second, third. A young woman shouted, "Finally happened!" And then, like a storm, the applause broke loose, roaring, crashing like waves against the shore. No one remained seated. People stood. Some cried, some embraced, some reached for neighbors he'd once ignored. Every stifled protest, every swallowed objection, every silent endurance now surged into a unified sound, the sound of relief. Naomi quietly placed the folder on the table, showing no pride, taking none of the applause for herself. Her gaze swept the room, cold, composed. Deep within it was something whole, something final, as though she knew this moment had just redefined the order of Willowbrook. She needed no thanks. She hadn't come to be liked. She had come to do what was right, and now that was done. I looked around and saw something that had never existed in Willowbrook Gardens before. Light in the eyes of the people. Not the fluorescent lights above, not the sunlight streaming through the windows, but the light of restored belief. The belief truth cannot be smothered forever. The belief those who abuse power, no matter how long they sit on a throne, will one day be held accountable, and that just, even if it arrives late, is still justice. Clarissa was escorted out of the hall to thunderous applause, but that applause was not a send-off. It was a farewell. Farewell to a stifling era now past. A few voices rang out, shouting, "Goodbye, fake queen! We don't need you anymore." No one bothered with courtesy anymore. They didn't speak bitterness, but with relief, like rain washing away years of thick dust from a rooftop. I turned to Naomi. She stood still, her expression unchanged, but I noticed one thing. In her eyes, cold as they seemed, there was a flicker of sadness, a flicker that came from knowing this was not just the end of one individual, but the beginning of something new for a community that had been silenced far too long. And so, Clarissa Montrose, the woman who once shouted in our faces haughty disdain, who saw herself as the living law of Willowbrook Gardens, left not in glory, but in handcuffs, to the sound of applause that was never meant for her. As the thunderous applause in the hall finally began to fade, I realized the space had changed. The weight of fear was gone. The averted eyes that had lingered for years were no longer there, and in their place were tears falling freely, uncontrollably. People cried, sobs rising from throats long held in silence. Families embraced, children clung tightly to their parents, not fully understanding what had happened, but sensing the relief in the eyes of the adult. Many who had once stayed silent out of fear now held their heads high, as if finally reclaiming the breath that had been taken from them long ago. A middle-aged woman standing on the left side of the room, her hand trembling as it clutched a small purse, spoke in a whisper that somehow echoed across the quiet hall. "All these years we endured. Today, we finally see the light." Her words pierced the air like a drill, spoken by an ordinary person but carrying a power that moved the entire community. Faces that had been lowered lifted suddenly, eyes met, and people realized they were not alone. They had never truly been alone. Naomi stood at the front, calmly fastening the button on her coat, tucking the gleaming badge back inside. A small gesture, but one that felt like closing an old chapter. She didn't smile broadly, didn't bask in glory, but offered a faint smile, her eyes steady with the same resolve that declared her work was not done. In that quiet composure burned a steady flame, a wordless promise. Willowbrook Gardens would no longer be a kingdom ruled by fear. I stepped forward and took my wife's hand. Her skin was cold as steel, but within it I felt a strange, unwavering strength. I whispered into Naomi's ear, just loud enough for her to hear, and just quiet enough to remind myself justice has finally returned to this place. The words lifted something heavy from my chest, as if the weight of weeks of silent burden had finally been released. I saw the residents around me nodding, some with tears in their eyes, others placing hands on their hearts, their eyes red and glistening. An elderly man with a cane rose to his feet, his voice raspy and full of emotion. "We used to think nothing could change, that silence was the safest choice. But today I see, if one person dares to stand up, even the darkness has to back." His words were met with murmurs of agreement, scattered claps that grew louder and steadier, swelling into a unified sound of shared understanding. A young man near the back of the hall called out in a strong voice, "We've lived too long in Clarissa's shadow. That shadow ends here, right now." A chorus of "That's right" echoed instantly, no longer timid, no longer restrained. I looked around the room, and every face radiated relief. People I had once seen bow their head or turn away when Clarissa walked by now stood tall, shoulders back, as if just breathing felt easier. A young woman whispered to her neighbor, "I never dared to hang that little flag in front of my house again. Now I will." The other laughed, nodding. "And I'll blast music at my son's birthday party so the whole neighborhood hears." Clarissa had been taken away long ago, but the echo of her collapse still reverberated. It was no longer just the image of a woman being arrested. It was the fall of an entire system built on fear. The air in the hall broke open, and one by one people began to share their story, their repressed grievances, the wounds they had never dared to speak aloud. Frail elderly woman said with a trembling voice, "She once told me to get rid of the old swing in my yard because it didn't match the neighborhood aesthetic. But that swing was a memory of my late husband. I cried for nights before I finally took it down." As she finished, a middle-aged man stepped forward and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. His voice choked, "No one will ever touch your memories again." The testimonies surged like a flood. The hall became a torrent of unlocked recollection. Each voice was a puzzle fitting back into the broader picture of Clarissa's tyranny. They wept, they laughed, they sighed, they embraced, and I knew this was the moment a real community was born again. Naomi stood in silence, listening, never interrupting, never judging. She let them speak, let them free themselves. I saw her eyes gleaming with resolve but also burdened, knowing these scars wouldn't vanish overnight, but at the very least, light broken through. A little girl, maybe 10, tugged at her mother's sleeve and asked in a clear voice, "Mom, can I ride my bike in the backyard now without anyone yelling at me?" The mother burst into tears, pulled her daughter into a hug, and nodded over and over again. That innocent question cut straight to the heart of everyone in the room. How many childhood fears stolen over the years? I felt it deep in my bones. Willowbrook Gardens had changed. The stifling, oppressive air had been replaced by uncontainable joy. Real smiles emerged for the first time in years. Handshake, greetings, laughter. They all returned, like neighbors seeing one another again after a long, devastating storm. Naomi turned to me and gave a quiet nod. I knew she wasn't looking for praise. All she ever wanted was to restore balance, to make sure people here could live with the rights they had always deserved. She had laid the first stone. The rest now belonged to the community. I looked around one last time and saw that Clarissa had vanished from the space, but the shadow she left behind had given way to something far stronger: unity. Willowbrook Gardens had broken open, not into chaos, but into a light that had just been rekindled. What sentence do you think is truly fitting for someone like Clarissa Montrose? Share your thoughts. I walked slowly along the brick-paved path in Willowbrook Gardens, sensing a shift not only in the atmosphere but in the smallest details of this place. The afternoon breeze no longer carried a chill, but instead brought with it the scent of flowers from garden beds recently tended after being long neglected. The leaves swayed high above, as if nodding in rhythm with a life slowly returning to its right course. But what caught my attention wasn't the trees or the perfectly arranged houses. It was the faces of the people I passed along the way. There was a lightness in their eyes, something that had nearly been lost now quietly reclaimed. Real smiles had returned after years of being stifled by senseless rules and vague threats. People looked at one another direct, greeted each other willingly, and conversed openly instead of whispering behind closed doors. These sounds weren't new, but only now did they ring true, not suppressed, not rehearsed, but honest echoes of a community coming back to life. It made me think, perhaps finally, this place was returning to what it was meant to be, not a neighborhood built for control, but one where people could find peace, trust, and connect. I stopped in front of my house, my eyes sweeping across the neighborhood, and what I saw caught in my throat for a moment. Mr. Henderson's home, once stripped flower pots because they were deemed visually now bloomed with golden chrysanthemums and baskets of geraniums hanging along the balcony. His old wooden door had been freshly painted, still holding its vintage charm, without needing anyone's design. At Mrs. Rose's, laughter rang out. Children ran across the yard, waving little flags, with no one scolding them for disturbing or violating noise ordinance. Even the Gonzalez family, who once received warning nearly faced a trash sent him blind, no longer, their gate wide open, welcoming neighbors in for tea, cornbread, steaming, old stories whisper. I looked at that scene and realized neighborhood spirit and smut. I came to realize something clearer than ever before. False power can blind people for a while, can make wrong things seem reasonable, can bully through black ink on paper and a self-important title, but it can never hold up forever under the light of. Clarissa Montrose built an entire world on fear. She used rules as weapons, turning the silence of residents into tools of control. For a time, she made people believe that not resisting was the only way to survive. But anything built on fear crumbles the moment people grow tired enough to lift their head. And that's exactly what happened. Not through a loud rebellion, but through small voice, one by one, linking together into a current no one could stop. When a community rises, no throne is too high to be pulled down. Naomi sat on the front porch, her face bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. She watched children ride their bikes along the curved brick path, once deemed play-restricted zones, out of fear they might damage the neighborhood's image. No one cared about those rules anymore. Naomi's face calm, unassuming, but her eyes still held the same sharpness I saw when I first met her on an old case, the kind of eyes that saw beyond the obvious. A neighbor, one who had once been fined by Clarissa for leaving his pickup parked longer than 2 hours, walked over, bowed his head slightly, and thanked Naomi for her courage. Naomi only nodded, responding soft, almost offhand. Guns aren't scary. A cruel heart is the real threat. It wasn't said to be dramatic, but it sliced through the air like a blade. The silence followed was heavy. Those nearby paused, then nodded, as if realizing at the same moment the problem problem had never been weapons. It was how people chose to wield power and influence to suppress one another. In that moment, I didn't see Naomi merely as the wife who had stood beside me through Count Journey, or as a federal agent. She was the embodiment of the voice justice this place had long forgotten. But what warmed me most wasn't Naomi herself. It was the people around her. Those once silent, hesitant residents now tall, willing to speak, to question, to live as they were meant to live. It was this community that truly became the main character of the story. The people who had endured, feared, faltered, and now were learning how to live again with dignity. That day, Willowbrook Gardens turned a new page. Whispered conversations behind curtains became open meetings, where people debated openly, where opinions were heard instead of silent. Those who once only knew how to lower their heads now knew how to say no, how to ask questions. Those once afraid of fines for hanging a birthday banner now host small parties for their neighbors. Eyes that used to avoid each other now met direct. Voices that once trembled now with confidence. No one feared surveillance, shame, or isolation for being different. They had learned something vital, that silence, when used as a weapon by others, only helps darks grow. But once a community stands together, that dark begins to recede. I tightened my grip on Naomi's hand, eyes fixed on the row of white-painted houses now glowing amber under the setting sun. The children were still laughing. The adults were shaking hands, talking, sharing visions of the future. A shared voice was beginning to take form, not from authority, but from agreement. And I knew that from this moment on, this place would finally be a true community. Not one run by fear, but one led by respect, by dialogue, by trust in one another. And I thought to myself, this lesson isn't just for Willowbrook Gardens. It's for any place where someone once believed they could rise above others simply because they held a bit of power. Justice may arrive late, perhaps very late, but when it does, it washes away every lie. Titles, bylaws, and polished facades can cover the truth for a while, but no one can hide forever. No one is powerful enough to sit above forever. I turned my gaze away from the brick path glowing in the dusk, where the shadows of trees stretched like the closing lines of a finished chapter. I didn't need to look back to know. From today, Willowbrook would no longer be a place of fear and control. It had become a place where every person had the right to hold their head high, a place where every voice held weight, a place where justice, once it found its way back, stay, as long as the people here were brave enough to protect. Looking back at everything that happened in Willowbrook Gardens, I realized we had gone through a journey filled with trial, where the cracks in what once seemed like a peaceful community exposed the entire. From one ordinary morning when Naomi stepped into the yard and was met with Clarissa Montrose's arrogant accusation, everything escalated into a series of events no one could have foreseen. Clarissa, claimed to represent community value, turned out to be someone who used her position to spread fear, divide residents, and maintain power through the silence of the vulnerable. Step by step, Clarissa's many masks were torn away, from the baseless 911 call aimed at Naomi to the moment police arrived and stood at attention before a federal badge. Her fabricated authority began to fracture. In an instant, the woman so used to barking orders became a spectacle, unraveled in front of everyone. But what made that reversal so profound wasn't just Naomi's revealed identity. It was the fact that, for the first time, the community witnessed deception laid bare in a way no one could deny. That wave spread fast. Residents began to rise, no longer afraid of senseless citations or heavy-handed threats. They spoke of years under pressure, of hanging a small flag, of owning a dog, of placing a trash bin a few inches off. Each turned into ammunition for Clarissa to assert her dominance. And when Naomi publicly delivered the Department of Justice's investigation order, the door slammed shut on the self-proclaimed Queen of the HOA. The cold snap of handcuffs on Clarissa's wrists marked final period of her reign of control in the neighborhood. But the most important shift wasn't Clarissa's fall. It was the community's awakening. In the moment she was escorted out, the hall no longer felt like a place of silence and submission, but a space of unity. Those who had once feared now spoke up. Families who used to lower their heads now stood tall, and children once scolded into stillness now played freely. The applause wasn't just for Naomi or for justice, but for themselves, finally reclaiming their voices. This story leaves behind more lasting lessons than any lecture could. First, it reminds us that false power, no matter how cleverly disguised, cannot survive forever when built on injustice. Clarissa may have controlled the narrative for a while, but truth always finds its way back, and once exposed, no authority can stop it. Second, it shows that silence, when allowed to persist too long, becomes injustice's greatest ally. The residents of Willowbrook Gardens looked the other way for years, believing safety lay in compliance. But that silence fed the cruelty, allowed Clarissa to grow unchecked. It wasn't until Naomi stood up that they realized true strength lies in standing together. Third, this is also proof of the necessity of those willing to stand their ground. Naomi didn't prevail through rage, but through calm resolve, unwavering conviction, and her belief in justice. She didn't need to shout nor seek the spotlight, but instead let the evidence, the truth, and her actions speak for her. It was that steadfast changed course of everything. And finally, this story carries a profound human message. What's truly frightening has never been a gun or a badge, but a cruel heart handed unchecked power. Willowbrook Gardens was once ruled by bias and pettiness, but once the shadows were cast out, it became a true community, one where people could hear each other, respect one another, and live as equals. As I held Naomi's hand and looked back at the neighborhood, I didn't just see a victory. I saw a reminder meant for every place. Justice may arrive late, but it never disappeared. As long as there are people willing to speak, the darkness will be torn apart. That is the greatest lesson Willowbrook Gardens has left, not just for ourselves, but for anyone who's ever lived in silence. This story ends here, but its echoes will linger, a quiet reminder that the truth always finds its way, and when a community stands united, no false authority can ever rise above the law.